Hi folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things. However, sometimes I find myself wishing that pre-existing tiny nerdy things were just a little bit bigger. So today I'm gonna do that. Of course, the first step in making any normal-sized nerdy thing is finding somebody else who's already done that and copying their work. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any good 3D versions of a big angry murder mushroom, so instead I'm gonna have to make my own. I'll start by stealing somebody else's 2D art and slamming it against the table until I've got a set of solid aluminium bones to build on top of that can then be attached to a big wooden sculpting block. Before building up my bony body into something slightly more sightly, I'll need to find the perfect screaming space monster pose and wrap that in a nice thick layer of foil. This particular fella's going to be pretty girthy, so I want to make sure I bulk out the body with cheap and cheerful foil, rather than spend a fortune on clay you'll never even see. Of course, that assumes that I have enough color-appropriate clay for a big, beefy green beastie, which I don't. However, I definitely do have enough blue and yellow clay, and if my rudimentary understanding of color theory is correct, I should be able to mash these two colors together to give me a nice green. That's not... there we go. A lovely orky green. I'll take this freshly mixed green mix and mash it onto my shiny aluminium body, mostly focusing on filling out the oversized frame. Once I've got enough girth girding all of my metal core, I can start haphazardly sketching out the musculature. The real beauty of making a 40k orc is that scale doesn't really matter. If I go a little overboard with the bulking process and make my orc 25% bigger than I had originally intended, well, that's fine. It just means he's an important orc. A knob rather than a boy, if you will, since the biggest is the bestest. Eventually, once I've got a sort of rough estimation of where I want my oversized muscles to be, I can start cleaning up the lines and building out the important bits, working my way into finer and finer detail until I've got 2/3 of a wonky mix of the Hulk and the Hunchback of Notre Dame. Hey folks, Editor Adam here. So I was looking up pictures of the Hulk and the Hunchback of Notre Dame to make a stupid Photoshop of them, and found out that in 1983, the Hulk literally goes to Paris and fights Quasimodo. And I think the world needs to know, at which point I can start smoothing and blending the rough cuts and fingerprints away with some soft silicone shapers. Of course, you're not going to be this big and beefy and not be hella vascular, so I'll dip my shaper in some liquid clay and draw some squiggly veins in appropriately veiny places before baking the body once, so as I can move on to making a head. To make the head, I've smooshed a little green ball in place before adding a big bottom jaw and blending it all together. A little awkward squishing and squeezing and pushing and prodding it will get me half the way towards an appropriately orky looking look. Then I can poke some little eye holes and add a little porcine nose in between, followed by some little black balls to make the eyes themselves. Then it's back to the masterclass of modeling that is randomly pushing clay around in the hopes that I can make it kinda look like what I want it to look like, before giving up and adding some ears in the hopes that it will bring the look together. It didn't, so I made a drastic decision and decided to cut away the bottom jaw with the intention of replacing it with a metal one in a minute or two. However, before I do that, I want to redden up the inside of the mouth, which I guess now that I've cut away the bottom jaw is kinda also the outside of the mouth, as well as make some oversized red gums into which I can fit some big, oversized orc teeth. A bit more gumming to make sure the teeth fit more comfortably, and a tongue attached to the jawless bottom jaw, then it's on to making something metal. Sometimes in the course of living their best lives, orcs lose one or two non-essential bits of their body and have them replaced with equally functional bits of metal, so I figured my orc could have a nice big shiny metal gob. So in place of the missing bottom jaw, I added a curved slab of gray clay complete with attachment bolts and a nice hand-hammered finish before finishing it off with some extra big metal teeth. I'll add some more bolts to keep those teeth in place before adding plenty of battle damage around the replacement jaw, as well as adding some final texture, wrinkling, and scarring to the top of Kyle's head. Oh yeah, this is Kilgore the Crushinator, Scourge of the Imperium, or Kyle for short. After a quick bake, I can sit back and decide that I don't actually like this jaw, so I'll chop it off and rebuild his bottom jaw with the green clay in the same way I did the first time around. Of course, now that I've greened up his gob, I need to finish building up the inside, which is now accurately inside, as well as add some non-metallic teeth to that bottom jaw. Same as the top, I'll gum up those teeth and add some much needed knobbly gob bits around his lips before giving the whole thing a brushing with isopropyl alcohol to blend the freshly added clay into the existing stuff, and that's my big angry orc face finished, which means it's time to make Kyle some clothes. I'll start with Kyle's pants by covering the remaining aluminium armature in a nice burlap sack brown, thickening it up in the necessary spots to ensure his legs are equal in size and proportion. 40k orcs tend to be pretty stocky, and the really old school models are like 95% upper body anyway, so again, I'm not too concerned with his overall proportions. Once the legs sorta look like legs, I can add the feet, which start as vaguely foot-shaped blobs slipped onto the tips of each leg, building up from the base until I've got a nice thick black boot. I'll blend it all together, then start to carve out the sharper lines as well as section off the portions that I want to remain leather, like the midsole and upper portion, while the bottom of the boot is going to end up being painted with metallics, so I'll make sure it's got a nice sharp metallic looking finish. As for the leathery bits, a bit of poking and prodding with a variety of rounded tools will give them a slightly creased and cracked look. Then I can go back to the pants and start adding wrinkles and folds by adding lots of little wormy dealies strategically placed everywhere that wrinkles and folds would form. Some more silicone shaper smoothing will hide the seams, and some big ball stylus work will sharpen the edges to make the fabric look a little bit stiffer. Finally, I'll add some seams along the edge of the pants, exaggerating them with the help of a wedge-shaped silicone shaper, before using a clay hook to carve some rips and tears into the trousers, which I'll then fill with more of the flesh-colored green color to show Kyle's shapely legs beneath. A bit of final texturing of the torn fabric atop said shapely legs will finish off the rips and tears, then I'll add some more little tears around the trousers that I'll make sure to stitch back together later. Before that though, I want to give the pants a bit of texture by way of this little curtain offcut that I'll press into the still soft clay to impart a nice burlap sack appearance. Finally, all these seams need to be stitched back together using some oversized stitches. Now, you might be wondering how these stitches could possibly keep his pants together. And that leads us into my favorite part of the 40k orc zeitgeist, which can be summed up in the immortal words of one of history's greatest orcish philosophers, René Descartes, who said, "Me think, therefore me is." Basically, when it comes to orc technology, as long as they believe it works, it does. For instance, there's no way that these stitches would keep Kyle's ample cake from spilling out, but he believes they will, so they do. However, with the pants done, I can get back to the boots, adding a bit of tread around the bottom of each boot before pressing a line into the middle of each boot so I can embed a leather strap around them, adding some hooks to keep them in place. I'll then add plenty of wear and tear to the edges, as well as some much needed little metal studs because why not? Finally, I'll give the metal bits of the boot some hand-hammered texturing, and in memory of the recently removed jawline, I'll give his toes some teeth instead. A last little bit of weathering for the metally bits of the boot, then it's back up to the pants where I'll add an appropriately spiky plate on Kyle's knee before adding some straps to the thigh of his other leg. Now you may be wondering why I keep jumping around instead of finishing off a section and then moving on to the next one, and it's simple. I don't have a plan at all, and I'm really just making this up as I go, which means adding little bits here and there until I'm content with what I've got. For instance, after all that, I decided I would rather Kyle had a big beer belly hanging over his pants instead of a six-pack, so I added a substantial amount of girth to his gut and textured it until it looked like the rest of his body before wrapping his waist in a little leather belt. At some point in there, I also added lots of detail to his abs and obliques and the muscles of his torso, but that's all a moot point since almost immediately afterwards I decided he'd be wearing a raggedy t-shirt, which I made by delineating the openings of his arms and neck before filling in all the blank space with thin strips of brown, thereby completely covering all the musculature that I spent hours making in the early stages of this video. Otherwise, much like I did with the pants, I'll add lots of wrinkles and fabric folds with the use of strategically placed wormy dealies scattered around the shirt, blended in with a sharp edge of a sculpting tool, which will hopefully make the folds look sharper and thinner, which I think helps make the fabric look less dense than his burlap sack pants. Finally, a quick blast with some isopropyl alcohol will help to blend out the unintentionally sharp sections, and I can start to add cuts and rips and tears in his shirt in the exact same way I did with his pants. His crotchal area is a bit bare, but I don't think space orcs have any kind of anatomy that needs to be protected by an all-metal banana hammock, so instead I'll fill that gap in with a lovely little fabric loincloth adequately ripped and torn and covered with a delightful little WAAAAAGGGGHHH belt buckle. For a little added variation in this t-shirt, I'll add some little leather patches here and there around his torso, held in place with more of those miraculous stitches, before wrapping a great big thick leather strap over his shoulder, weathering the leather appropriately. The thick leather shoulder strap will help to secure the single piece of upper body armor he'll be wearing, which of course will be a great big spiked shoulder pad, complete with its own set of wonky metallic orc teeth. I'll make sure the teeth look like they're well worn and battered before adding more of the hand-hammered texture to the shoulder plate, lots of little nicks and scratches and gouges, and some more of those little bolts to help keep it all in place. Otherwise, that's the majority of the body built, but before I can make his hands, I need to give him something to hold. I figured what good is an orc without a shoota, so I'll start by carving the main body of my massive orc pistol, attaching a little flat grip, then baking it so I can start building up the rest of the body. By baking the center of the gun first, I've given myself a nice solid surface that I can use as a frame to add the detail on top of, which is a lot easier than trying to sculpt something like this without deforming it while I work. Unlike a Space Marine bolter, I think the orc weaponry tends to be a lot less uniform in its design, so I'm less concerned about making something that's immediately recognizable. After all, the orc philosophy of if I thinks it works, then it does, extends to their weaponry as well, so as long as it looks like it might be a gun, then it should work like one too. Of course, one thing I hadn't considered was how front-heavy this little blaster was going to be, and I'm a little concerned that the sheer weight of the tip is going to snap the handle, so I'll drill a couple little holes along the inside of the barrel that I can fit a couple lengths of armature wire down into, then bend them back along the handle to provide some extra support. With the supports in place, I can cover them up by creating a thicker grip on the handle, then all that's left to do is add the last bit of detailing and greeblies, then add a magazine to the underside and cut a little custom orc symbol onto the side of the barrel. I'll then wrap the handle in a long flat wormy dealy so it's got a nice leathery grip, and it's into the oven to bake, at which point I realize this is way too clean for an orc weapon. So I'll use a scalpel and some sanding files to make it look a lot less pretty, then drill some little indents and extra damage onto the sides before finally gluing some barrels onto the front. And with that, I've got a wonky shooter ready, but before I can attach it, I need to make some claws. I considered giving Kyle a shoota and a big axe or a sword or something like that, but I really didn't want to make a second hand, so instead of a hand, I'm going to give him a great big metal claw, which of course means I need to make some blades for said claw, which is what I'm doing here. I've cut a couple identical blades out of a thick sheet of clay, then cut the blades down into a sharper taper along the edge, then once they've been baked, I can use some files and sanding sticks to sharpen up the sharper bits and flatten all the flat bits. Some final nicks and gouges in the sharp bits of the blade will finish off my two matching top claws and my one wonky bottom claw, and I can set them aside for later while I get back to the pistol. Because I added the armature wire to the gun, I can easily attach it to Kyle's arm by drilling some little holes in the arm nub and pushing it into place before building up the gripping hand with more green clay. Rather than add individual fingers, I'll sculpt Kyle's hand directly onto the grip of the gun, carving the fingers and gnarling up the knuckles for a single slab of green meat. Once I've built up the overall shape of the hand and connected it seamlessly to the existing forearm, I can start to clean everything up before brushing it with some IPA and adding that last little bit of detail. With the fingernails in place, Kyle's at least got one functioning hand, however, the other side's a bit of a different story. I figured he'll need some sort of pneumatic system to work his mechanical claw, so I'll drill a little hole in his bicep so I could fit a wooden dowel into his arm and connect it to the slab of clay that, with a bit of cutting and smoothing and shaping, will become the body of his claw. However, while this claw is probably anatomically correct in terms of how it lines up with his forearm, it won't look as good at this angle, so I'm going to suspend disbelief a bit in the interest of artistic license and rotate the claw so all of the blades are clearly visible. As for the big hole in his bicep, I can easily fill that with some wires bent to shape and cut to size. Otherwise, I can only hope that you, the viewer, are willing to accept that this 9-foot-tall green mushroom-based spacefaring monstrosity whose science is based entirely on a belief system can operate his big mechanical arm claw at an awkward angle. I'll build the claw in several stages, baking and sanding in between to keep the surface nice and sharp. I don't really have a plan as far as what this claw is supposed to look like, but much like this entire sculpt, I'm really just making it up as I go and hoping it doesn't look like shit. Once I've got the general shape of the fist figured out, I'll drill a couple holes so I can mount the blades via armature wire, which will let me position them just right before adding little bits and bobs that will kinda make it look like it might kinda make sense in a Space Ork kind of a way. Mostly that means big chunky blocks and more pneumatic pumps covered in big slabs of metal. Also, before I bake it this time, I'll remember to make the topmost layer look appropriately wonky and slapped together, poking and prodding it until it's looking barely functional. I'll drill a couple holes on the back side to add a bit more cabling connecting the arm and the claw, then I can fill in any of the open holes so they look a little bit more organic, as well as add some final greeblies and slapped on middle bits. Now with the claw finished, and before I do one final bake, I'll work my way around the body, adding some final full body greeblies like a belt of big ass bullets to the leather strap on Kyle's chest, a pair of stick grenades to his otherwise pointless leg straps, some metal plates to the top of his head where he might have a tiny bit of brain damage, and a nice leather wrist wrap and a metal plate around his still existing gun-toting wrist. Finally, before I call it good enough, I'll wrap one of his teeth in a metal sheet as well, cause why not? And with that, we are finally 16 minutes into this video, done with the sculpting, which means it's time to add a bit more color. One of the reasons I love sculpting with colored clays is that the worst part of painting, getting your base coats in place, is basically already done. At this point, it's kind of like a paint by numbers, so I'm just slapping heavy, similarly colored washes on all the already colored bits to create a bit of shading. Once those washes have dried, I can then start working my way around doing the fun stuff. For the green of the skin, because it's organic, I'm going to be using my airbrush to build up some lighter greens before working my way around a second time with a yellow to really kick up the vibrancy. I'll then use some pink through the airbrush to add a soft gradient between the reds of the lips and the nose and ears and elbows before switching over to a brush to create some harsher lines on top. I'll fill some of the scars with some darker reds and purples to make them look extra angry, then it's time to crack out a sponge so I can start adding some texture. Same as I did with the airbrush, I'll work my way around the body starting with a hella watery green before tickling the pink bits with a bit more vibrancy. To add a bit more wear and tear to the teeth, I'll break one of the big teeth off before base coating them with an all-over bone white, washing with an umber, and highlighting with some ivory and white. Ork eyes are nice and easy as they get a basic black base with two little beady red dots in the middle. Well, one each eyeball, two in total. While I've got the red on the brush, I'll paint the tips of the chest bullets, then it's on to painting the shirt, starting with a messy brown to highlight the high points on the shirt before working my way up to lighter shades, gently tickling the tips of each brown highlight. To give the trousers a bit of a different look and to take advantage of the burlap sack texture, I'll aggressively dry brush several shades of progressively lighter browns and beiges over top. For the black of the boots, I'll give them a lighter charcoal swipe with slashes of gray so they look like weathered leather, then I'll work my way around the rest of the body, stippling browns and beiges over the patches and sashes and belts and buckles, glazing over top with multiple light coats of browns to produce a lovely brown weathered leather look. To break up all that brown and beige, I'll paint all the stitches with a dark red highlighted with lighter and lighter reds before swiping at the hanging loincloth with some light oranges to give it a worn fabric look. With that, all the fabric and skin is done, so all that's left to do is hit all the metally bits with a base coat of duraluminum to set the metal base coat. Well, that's redundant. Basically, all the gray bits in the black boots and the single tooth get painted with a metal base, then I'll work my way around with a sponge, sponging some darker shades of metallics over the top so there's a bit of variation in the surface. I'll then follow that up with a sepia wash to tint the metallics slightly brown and to add a bit of dark rusty color to the corners and in the recesses before breaking out my yellowest yellow on a sponge to add a bit of high quality orc coloring. I'll then switch over to the black to add a bit more contrast in the colors cause orcs is artistic, then I'll clean up some of the yellow by replacing it with that first metal color where the paint would be chipping away, as well as sponging some more metallics haphazardly around since upkeep of armor isn't first and foremost in an orc's mind. I'll take a nice rusty color and water it down, then apply it to any of the gouges and dents and around all the bolts and edges of the armor before coming back with a much darker, dirtier rust color and applying that more conservatively over the top with a sponge. I'll then follow this up with a final dry brushing of a silver to catch the edges and add some final edge highlighting on all the metally bits. The wires I primed white, then painted black with gray dashes to make them look a little like cables. Then I can finish Kyle off by coating his mouth and eyes in a lovely shiny high gloss varnish. And with that, we're all done here and... well, no, actually we're not done yet because Kyle needs an appropriately quality base. And for the first time in forever, I know exactly what I'm gonna do. This is a teeny tiny sloped base that most minis stand on, and I want to make one for Kyle, but like full-sized. Which means I need to take this extra girthy foam block and cut it down. Now I do have a hot wire cutting table, but this particular block is way too big, which means I'm gonna have to do it the awkward way. So after just a bit of elbow grease and a surprising lack of sawed fingers, I'm left with an appropriately thick sheet of foam that I need to somehow turn into a tapered circle. Which is where that aforementioned hot wire table comes in handy. I'll adjust the angle of the wire until it's, I don't know, angled enough. Then I can find the center of my block and using a nail, pin it to my fence. And with that in place, it's a simple case of slowly feeding the foam into the wire and letting nature take its course. Which leaves me with a terrific looking extra large miniature base. A quick size check ensures Kyle will fit nicely, but I need something for him to stand on. And I know just what to use. This is Bob, the north of the border space marine, and one of my all-time favorite sculptures. And I need his head. You see, Bob is standing atop a defeated orc, and I thought it would bring balance to the karmic scales if Kyle was standing atop a defeated space marine. However, I would really rather not sculpt another space marine just to have something for Kyle to stand on, so instead I'm going to behead Bob and cast his crown in some silicone so that I can make a perfect copy out of resin. With my silicone cured, I can remove Bob's beheaded head from the bamboo base, and with some careful knife work, I can free him from his milky white prison, leaving his head completely unharmed and ready to be surgically reattached. In the meantime, I'm left with a terrific little mold with which I can recast Bob's brain box in some quick cure epoxy resin to create an unnamed space marine upon which Kyle will be proclaiming his love of a good scrap. Of course, why stop at one head? No, instead, Kyle's going to be standing on an entire squad of space marines. The only minor problem is that each of these heads is a copy of Bob, who's got a bit of battle damage, but that should be easy enough to hide by just adding way more battle damage. I'll cut some larger chunks out of most of the marine heads, then drill some big bullet holes in a select few heads, roughing up the edges so it's not quite so clean an entry wound. And then for one special head, I'll drill an even larger hole and fill that half of the head with an exposed skull. It doesn't need to be too clean, since I'm assuming whatever tore the helmet to pieces probably wasn't concerned with the wearer's health either. Now, with a literal pile of space marine heads good to go, I can't just sit them on the base since they'd all sit flush to the ground, so I need to pull out some of my foam. I'll then mix up a bucket of hole filler, rocks, cork bits, and PVA glue that I can slather over the base to make my dirty, rocky ground cover. Once I've got the whole base covered in my paste, I can begin pressing the heads down into the dip, adding a second layer to build up the height for Kyle's foot. The PVA glue will ensure the hole filler dries solid, and it'll help keep the heads in place. As for the rest of the base, I figured a miniature basing appropriate layer of corkboard will work perfectly as smashed up bits of concrete paving. A trio of cork rocks on the side will help to hold up a wooden stake driven into the ground, and I can take my last Space Marine helmet and hot glue it onto the tip of the stick. A little bit of modeling paste will give the cork a more concrete top coat, and after a few hours everything is dry and ready for a full black primer, followed by a white zenithal highlighting. I considered painting the helmets with the same colors as Bob's chapter for more of that karmic balance, but I think that there's probably enough brown in this sculpture as it is, so in the end I opted to paint the helmets blue. Except for the one on the wooden stake, which I painted red. I'll then work my way around the helmets, wet blending several lighter shades of blues over that initial layer until I've got a nice variation in highlights, at which point I'll convert the exposed skull helmet into a lieutenant's helmet by painting a white line down the center and covering it with a red. While I've got the red on my brush, I'll give the sergeant's head on a stick a bit of highlighting as well. Then it's time to add the little details, most of which I'll paint in black, including the lenses at this point, since I don't know that the helmets are connected to a power source anymore, so all the lights are going to be turned off. A bit of gray and plain steel will add highlights on top of the black, and I can start sponging some charcoal all over the helmets to create the initial layer of battle damage, followed by some darker grays and a final strategic dusting of light gray. Otherwise, with the helmets painted appropriately, I can color the rest of the base by painting the dirt with dirt-colored paints and the concrete with concrete-colored colors. While I wait for the browns and grays to dry, I'll give the skull a sepia wash, then give all the helmets a heavy watery black wash to add a final layer of shading, followed by a heavy dry brushing of grays and off-whites over the concrete and helmets to catch the sharp edges and give the metal and bone a bit more of a weathered and worn look. Now the real star of this show is the pigment powder, which gets sprinkled over the concrete to create a dusty gray look, then over everything else to create a dirty, dusty, weathered and worn finish. I'll then pop Kyle in place and make sure his feet are appropriately dusty, which will help him blend into the base rather than stand out with sparkling shiny shoes, before locking everything in place with a spritzing of fixing spray. Finally, I'll paint the rim of the base black and I can pop Kyle back down onto the base, at which point I'll give his goopy gob a bit of goopy stringy glue, since I imagine he's screaming at the top of his lungs, launching little strands of spittle everywhere. Otherwise, with that, we're finally all done here and on to the glamour shots. As always, a big old thank you to the fine folk over on Patreon, and a special hey how are you to the newest of them, Odo Bio, Steph, Romclus, Cam Hosking, Adam, Lass House, Orion Bookwormski, Catherine, Mark, Caleb, Amelia, Lynn and Mango, Skibbity Dub 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 Yes Yes, Osmet, Constance, Tyler Fott, Desiree Gowell, Green Chib, Shino Kamisama, Sebastian Schubert, and Yo Mama. You are the little headless helmets that this big angry orc of a channel stands upon. Good God, this video took a while. In fact, it took so long that you can actually track my recovery from the sinus infection I had as the video progresses. As always, like that smash, and don't forget to... Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.